Welcome to this online lesson on Stalin's Russia. What made the USSR so brutal under Joseph Stalin? Our aims today are to know the background of the creation of the USSR, which we will also refer to as Communist Russia and by some other names too, to explain the effects of Stalin's policies, and to evaluate the extent of Stalin's effects on the USSR. A bit of background then. Firstly, the Russian Revolution. Before understanding Stalin's Russia, it is useful to know how Tsarist Russia became the communist USSR. This is a complex topic worthy of its own lesson or series of lessons, so we're just going to have a look at it in brief. In the description to this video, I have linked a video which gives a very brief history of the Russian Revolution. For example, Tsarist Russia means Russia under the Tsars or the kings. That is a system of government that the Russians got rid of in 1917, but like I say, watch the video and it'll give you a brief overview so that you are able to proceed with this lesson if you've got no existing knowledge of Russian history. After you've watched the video, you can complete these brief summary tasks. 1. Who was the Tsar or king before the revolution? Secondly, when did the Russian Revolution start? Note that there are often two dates given for this, the first revolution and the second. Thirdly, give 3 reasons why the Russian people began the revolution. And fourthly, what were the two sides in the civil war? Lastly, who led the Bolshevik revolution? The Bolsheviks were one of the sides in the civil war and in the revolution, and they were the communists. Okay, you can pause the video here, watch the simple history video that I've linked in the description, and then come back and complete those questions. We'll have a look at some possible answers afterwards. So pause the video now. Done? Well, let's have a look at some potential answers. Let's have a look at some answers. Remember, you can always add detail to your answers if they're not good enough. Who was the Tsar or king before the revolution? This was Tsar Nicholas II. That word Tsar, it comes from the same root word as the Latin word Caesar and also the German word Kaiser. It all basically means ruler or king, so it's King Nicholas II or Tsar Nicholas II. The Russian Revolution started in 1917, regardless of which particular revolution you're looking at. Give 3 reasons why the Russian people began their revolution. Well, there are several reasons you could go with here. Here are some of the more common ones. By all means, add to your answer if you didn't get 3. Firstly, there's Russia's poor performance in World War I. The Russian army was outdated and poorly led and trained. It continually lost against the Germans. Secondly, the weak leadership of the Tsar. This is in a general sense. He wasn't very good at controlling his people or his government, but more to the point, he made a fatal error when he personally took command of the army in World War I. That meant that when the army continued to lose, it didn't make the soldiers happier. They instead started to blame him personally. Then we've got the influence of Rasputin on the royal family. This is a tricky one that you probably only really knew about if you had some existing knowledge of Russian history beforehand. Rasputin was a controversial so-called mad monk figure who was claimed to have had almost magical or spiritual healing powers. The reason why the royal family were taken in by this is because the only son and heir, Alexei, to Tsar Nicholas II, had a condition which meant that his blood didn't clot and that he would bleed out if he even got a very minor injury. Rasputin appeared at least to be one of the few people who could control this condition, and he got way too much influence on the royal family and it caused a real scandal. Anyway, that's possibly for another lesson. One of the more obvious ones, but a really big one, was food shortages. The disruption of the war and disruption to transport and so forth meant that there were huge food shortages and starvation in Russia. Hungry people tend to kick off against their rulers. And lastly, the inequality of Russia. Ordinary working Russians had incredibly harsh lives, and this was contrasted with the incredibly luxurious lives of many of their rulers, particularly the royal family. And the royal family was seen to be really quite clueless about the plight and the hardships suffered by their people. The two sides in the Civil War were the White Army that supported the old Russia, if you like, with the royal family, and the Red Army which supported the new Bolshevik revolution. Ultimately, it should be pointed out that at the end of that civil war, the entire Russian royal family were murdered by the Bolsheviks. Number 5, who led the Bolshevik Revolution? Well, there were several leaders really, but probably the biggest one was this man, Vladimir Lenin. However, in this photograph, he's shown with 2 other key leaders of the Russian Revolution, and we're only going to be able to touch on one of those in any great detail today, which is kind of the nature of just being able to do one lesson on this. On the right, we have Leon Trotsky. And on the left, we've got the focus of today's lesson, Joseph Stalin. Not his original name. Stalin kind of means man of steel. I'm certainly not saying that he's Superman, but Joseph Stalin is how he's best well known. Let's have a look at a bit more background then. We're going to have a look at the idea of communism now. Right, before I go any further, this is a little bit tricky, especially if you're not particularly kind of up to date on political knowledge. But communism is a much misunderstood and misquoted ideology. In other words, an idea about how the world should be run. So if you don't get this first time round, give yourself a bit of a break because it is pretty tricky. But you can always look back over this again and try and compare it to your existing understanding of the world. In brief then, in the 1920s and 1930s, democracy, those systems of government where governments are elected for a vote, like the USA and UK, the democracies were challenged by two main ideologies. One was fascism. Examples of this include Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Nazi Germany. You may have already done some work on them. The other is communism, at this time such as Stalin's Russia. These two ideologies are political opposites, but both have brutal dictatorships in charge to enforce the rule of their ideology. That's an interesting point. It's unusual for these ideologies to come about freely, and in order to keep controlling them, they need a brutal dictator at the top. So let's have a closer look at communism today. Note this down as a subheading. What is communism? Communism was thought up by Karl Marx in the 1800s. It is sometimes therefore known as Marxism. Marx believed that history was a story of class struggle, and he pointed back to events in the past to try and demonstrate this. Marx argued that first of all, kings would rule everyone, much like the Tsar had in Russia. So you might start like this, with the kings saying, I'm in charge of everybody. Think about British history as well. That would certainly seem to be true. Think about for how much of British history up until the English Civil War, you had the monarch or the king or queen in sole charge of the country. Marx then argued that then kings would be overthrown or have their power limited by a group of people that he called the bourgeoisie. It's really easy to understand the bourgeoisie if we simplify it. So one way of looking at the bourgeoisie is they are kind of educated, wealthy business people. As they gain lots of money and influence, they take over more of the power. I've illustrated this with a group of Victorian gentlemen. So what you've got is the kings were in charge, and then Marx argued that by the 19th century, the so-called present as it was for him, that rich business owners or the bourgeoisie are in charge. Modern Marxists would claim that many countries are still in that stage of class struggle. But it's up to you to decide whether the billionaires who dominate so much of the world's wealth at the moment really represent the bourgeoisie or something else. Now we're getting into political theory, which is probably more degree level, not key stage 3. So, the king's in charge, then the bourgeoisie take power, these are the rich middle classes, and then Marx argued that the next logical stage was that the workers would overthrow the rich because they'd been exploited by them. They would then share everything equally among the workers. There would be no such thing as rich, no such thing as poor, just everybody equal and sharing everything together. Which might seem like a nice idea, especially if you're a 19th century person who's paid absolutely nothing for doing hours and hours and hours of work every single week. You would feel exploited by your rich overseers, and you'd probably be quite keen to get rid of them and have more rights for yourself. This made communism quite a tempting idea for many people at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Some follow-up tasks to these, and again, I realise that these are quite challenging if these are new concepts to you. Firstly, create a labelled diagram showing Marx's idea of class struggle. You can base this on the diagram I've done on the right if you like, showing how there's a procession from kings being in charge to the rich and then to the workers. Secondly, workers often had very hard and unfair lives. Why would this make communism an attractive idea to them? And lastly, as a further challenge, in reality, how likely is it that everything could or would be shared equally by the workers? Pause the video while you complete those tasks and then press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, one final recap. In a very simple form, Marx's class struggle goes from kings being in charge to the rich being in charge, exploiting the workers, and then the workers overthrowing them and running things for themselves equally. Why would this be such an attractive idea? Well, many workers were incredibly unfairly treated. They had very little power. They didn't often have the vote, for example, and they really felt that it was because they were creating all the wealth, they deserved to get an equal share in it. But why is it perhaps unlikely that this really would be shared equally? Well, I want you to consider something. Imagine that you're in a lesson. Imagine that you worked incredibly hard in that lesson and you did absolutely everything you could to make it the best lesson you could. You wrote pages and pages of work. And then at the end of the lesson, the teacher said, I'm really impressed with the entire class. I'm going to give everybody 10 reward points. Well, what about if you knew that the person next to you had copied your work? Or the person behind you had done nothing and written nothing? Would you feel it was fair to give everybody 10 points? Or would you want to have a greater reward for yourself? Well, this is where human nature comes into it, and it can get quite complicated. Not everyone in society does make an equal contribution, and so elements of inequality still creep in, even if, arguably under communism, there's no rich and there's no poor. It's one of the real things that it's difficult to get your head around with communism, and arguably there's no communist country yet that has quite managed to master this idea. Let's have a look at the competing ideologies in Europe in around 1938. Again, by ideologies, we're just looking at the sort of worldview and the political system that these places operated under. In order to complete this task, you'll need a map like the one on the screen. I've included a link in the description of this video to one such map, or your teacher may be able to provide you with one. Whatever, try and get yourself a copy of that map to begin with, or else you could complete it as a colour-coded list of different countries. Firstly, let's have a look at which nations in Europe were democracies in around 1938. I'm not going to list them all here, otherwise we'll be here all day, but a few typical ones include the UK, France, Ireland, which by this point was free from the UK, Norway, Sweden, and even Czechoslovakia, though not for long because Hitler was going to invade it. Next, we have the fascist dictatorships. I've shown these in yellow. The principal ones are Nazi Germany, Franco's Spain, Mussolini's Italy, and Romania. And then we have the communist dictatorships. All right, there's only one of these, but it is a big one, the USSR. Just this is another word for communist Russia. Lastly, we've got other dictatorships which were dominant in Europe. These didn't necessarily mean that they were communist. It just meant that they still operated under a system where one person was in charge. A reminder that a dictator is a person who's in sole charge of the country. In other words, they dictate what goes on. They tell them what to do themselves. So Hitler was a dictator, Stalin was a dictator, Mussolini was a dictator, and so forth. So we can see that Europe is a patchwork of these different ideologies. Typically, democracies tend to be in the west of Europe. Fascist dictatorships are sort of spread throughout Europe from the west to the Central European region, and communism is dominant in the east with the USSR. It should be pointed out that the USSR included countries in addition to Russia. It's not just the country that we call Russia today. All right, your tasks then. Firstly, choose your own colours and create a key like the one above. Secondly, create your own map. And thirdly, in your view, which system seems most dominant in Europe at this time? Explain your choice. You can pause the video while you complete that. So hopefully we've got this idea that all of these different ideologies are competing in Europe and they all want to be more powerful. Ultimately, democracy would arguably win out, because at the end of the Second World War, although Russia remained communist, the rest of these dictatorships had mostly been overthrown. I say mostly, not all of them had been, but most of them had been. That sets up the next great clash, doesn't it? With Western Europe dominated by democracy, allied with the United States, and Russia and its Eastern allies all united under communism. A little thing that we call the Cold War, but that's for a future lesson. We're now going to do a comparison between communism and fascism, looking at two case studies. Firstly, let's consider Nazi Germany. You may have done some lessons on Nazi Germany already. Nazi Germany was led by Adolf Hitler from 1933 onwards. Its politics were fascism or Nazism, which is known as the extreme right wing. If you're unfamiliar with this, right-wing politics tends to put the country as the most important thing, with other countries and other races as being inferior. Not all right-wing politics is, of course, like that. Not at all. That's what we call the extreme right-wing. It all dates back to the French Revolution, where the wings of a building depended on which way you were voting. So people on the right wing of the building, they tended to vote in favour of keeping the king, and the people on the left wing of the building, they tended to vote to try and get rid of the king and reform the country. Okay, this is a massive simplification, but if you're unfamiliar with that term, that gives you an idea. So if you ever hear the term left wing and right wing in politics, it refers to these different ideas as to what's more important, the people and the workers, or the nation itself. The system of government in Nazi Germany is what's known as a fascist dictatorship. This is characterised in the following ways. All other political parties were banned. Anyone who speaks out against the Nazis might be executed or imprisoned in a concentration camp. All businesses were controlled by the Nazi party, including the workforce. However, private businesses may exist if they follow Nazi rules. And extreme racism and anti-Semitism were features of Nazism. Anti-Semitism being crimes against the Jewish people. What about this stuff about private businesses? Well, what that means is you can own your own business and make your own money from it. It doesn't automatically go to the government. Soviet Russia, on the other hand, looked like this. It was led by a man called Joseph Stalin, more on him in a moment, and he led Soviet Russia from 1922 onwards. Its politics were communism. This is the opposite to fascism and Nazism and is known as the extreme left wing. The system of government was a communist dictatorship. All other political parties were banned. Anyone who spoke out against communism might be executed or imprisoned in a Gulag labour camp. More on those later. All industries and businesses owned and controlled by the nation or the state. Individuals could not own them. There were no private businesses or property whatsoever. And everyone was theoretically equal. But some groups seen as disloyal to communism were treated terribly. But there wasn't necessarily this same undertone of racism in the same way that there was in Nazi Germany. However, you're probably noticing that there's actually quite a few overlaps here. Firstly, identify 3 similarities between Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. Identify 3 differences between Nazi Germany and Communist Russia. Overall, are the two countries more similar or more different? Explain what you think in a short paragraph with examples that you can take from the diagrams. Lastly, if you have time, review your diagram about communism and class struggle. Is the USSR really following Marx's ideas? Explain your view with examples. Okay, pause the video here. You'll want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes on this probably. Alright, let's have a look. Hopefully in terms of similarities, we've noticed that political parties are banned in each of these countries, except for, of course, the Nazi Party in Germany and the Communist Party in Russia. Also, there's a huge amount of restriction of freedom in terms of people who spoke out against it, not having freedom of speech and getting punishment for it. You'll notice that both have quite a lot of control of businesses as well, although quite obviously Soviet Russia has a greater amount. In terms of differences then, well, we have concentration camps in Nazi Germany and gulags in Soviet Russia, although they are reasonably similar in their overall effects. Also, the political systems are very different. Communism in Russia, fascism in Germany. Also, they're both very, very unfair to different groups of their population, but along different lines. In Germany, it tends to be much more along racist lines. So in other words, if you were not racially considered part of Germany, you'd have terrible crimes committed against you. In Russia, it was much more about whether or not you followed along with what the Communist Party wanted. For example, one thing that I didn't include for Soviet Russia, but I could have done, is that, strictly speaking, you were not allowed to express a freedom of religion. Although this isn't something that they were entirely able to get rid of, the idea of religion was actually against communism because it was this idea that only the party should be worshipped. So, let's have a think. Are these countries more similar or more different? Hopefully you made your mind up there. But is Marx's communism really represented in Soviet Russia? Well, you'd have to consider whether or not people are really being treated equally here. After all, it looks like there are an awful lot of restrictions on people's freedom just to get them to go along with this idea. More on that in a moment. We're going to have a look at now 4 brief case studies that show us how rough life could be in Soviet Russia. The first that we're going to have a look at is the Kulaks. Add that as a subheading now. Many poor and working class people in Russia believed that communism would give them a better life than it did before, as long as they didn't speak out against it. However, not all felt the same. It's worth pointing out that many people in Russia before the revolution had incredibly harsh lives anyway. So in some respects, perhaps they did see their lives improve. One group that didn't, though, were this group of people called the Kulaks. Kulaks were a more wealthy class of peasants who owned their own farms under the Tsar. Stalin's communist government took over their farms by force in a process called collectivization. Think about that word. It's where you collect things together into one big whole. Well, here's the effects that had. Kulaks lost their land, their farms becoming part of enormous collectivized farms called kolkhoz. My Russian pronunciation is probably pretty poor there, but a kolkhoz was essentially a huge collected group of farms which might have hundreds of thousands of people working on it. Kulaks had to surrender their produce to the Communist Party to be redistributed to other people. This is the idea of everybody getting an equal share. However, distribution of food was inefficient and harvest was sometimes poor. Many Kulaks couldn't even eat their own produce because it would be confiscated from them and given to someone else. The idea was it was being shared out fairly, but it's hardly fair if you grow your own food and you can't, and then you end up starving. Here's the really grim bit. At least 5 million peasants died following the famine of 1932 to 33, which was a direct result of this policy of collectivization. Kulaks who resisted by hiding food or complaining might be executed or sent to a Gulag work camp. Source A shows some of the effects of this. This is a group of Kulak children in the early 1930s. They're homeless, they're sleeping rough, and ultimately they are starving. Some follow-up tasks then. You'll want to spend about 10 minutes on these. Describe who the Kulaks were. Explain how collectivization led to Kulaks suffering and include examples of how they suffered. And thirdly, study source A. How can we infer that Kulaks suffered under communist rule? Remember that when we infer from sources, we go beyond what is immediately obvious. You can use a writing frame like the one I've included in the blue box if you wish. I can infer that, and then you'd maybe make some sort of point as to what you can infer about the suffering of the Kulaks. A detail in the source that tells me this is, and you pick a specific detail that you can actually see in the source and explain what it means. Okay, about 10 minutes on that, so pause the video here. Let's move on to case study number 2. Case study 2, the Gulags. Anyone who spoke out against the communists was considered an enemy of the state. People might even denounce other people they didn't like just to get rid of them. By denouncing, we mean that really tales were told on them to the authorities so that they would be rounded up and possibly executed or transported away. These denouncements might be based upon real facts, or it might just be based upon the fact that someone didn't like someone else. Pretty terrifying either way. People who weren't executed right away might be sent to a Gulag work camp, and the Gulags were as follows. They were very remote, often thousands of miles away in the cold depths of Siberia. They're incredibly harsh. Guards might regularly beat and kill inmates. Work was hard. Often people did dangerous work such as mining. Workers were given little food or appropriate clothing. For example, if you were working outside in winter, you might not be given a coat. Gulags were secretive. Little was known about them, which only increased the fear, because much knowledge amongst the people of them was based upon terrifying rumours. People might be sent to Gulags for years, decades, or they might simply disappear forever and never return. Families of these people would rarely know actually where they went or what had happened to them. This only again added to the fear factor of basically being arrested in the middle of the night and disappearing never to be seen again. Lastly, it is thought around 18 million people ended up in Gulags between the 1920s and the 1950s. They didn't always stay there, sometimes they were released again eventually. Some of these people included German prisoners of war who may stay there until well after World War II ended, but it is a huge number of people. Possibly as many as 1,600,000 people died. But we can never be sure. Detailed records of the deaths were never kept. Source B is a secretly taken photograph of sleeping quarters in a gulag in the 1940s. The fact that this was taken in a hurried and secretive manner goes some way towards explaining why it's such poor quality. Indeed, there are relatively few photographs that exist of the Gulags while they were in operation. Your tasks then. Firstly, describe what a Gulag was. Secondly, explain why the Russian people feared Gulags so much. Include examples of how this fear was encouraged. And then, like we did before, study source B. How can we infer, what can we infer about conditions in the Gulags? Again, you can use the writing frame on the screen if necessary. About 10 minutes on that maximum. Pause the video while you complete that task. Hopefully we've been able to infer about the primitive living conditions in the Gulag there. You can see that there are very few blankets, the beds are terribly uncomfortable, but also look at the condition of the prisoners. Most of them have got their heads shaved, they look thin and underfed, they also look pretty scared too. Case study number 3, the Great Purge. Stalin was very paranoid. This meant that he believed that he had enemies everywhere, even if he didn't. But between 1936 and 1938, he launched a terrifying assault on anyone he suspected of being against his rule. However, Stalin was quite clever here. He very rarely put his own name to execution orders and instead left this responsibility to other people to do his dirty work for him. This meant that, weirdly, many Russian people carried on worshipping him and not blaming him for the disappearances and the violence. Stalin put a man called Beria in charge of the NKVD, his secret police. People who were accused of being against Stalin were put on show trials. These trials were unfair and just designed to disgrace the accused person. They were nothing to do with trying to find out whether or not they were really guilty. Millions ended up in gulags. As many as 1.2 million people may have been executed or later died in the gulags as a result of the Great Purge. As a result, Stalin ended up surrounded only by people who were too terrified to criticize him. This meant that he often got bad advice. People weren't prepared to give Stalin difficult truths because they were worried about what the consequences might be, so they just said whatever things they thought Stalin wanted to hear. Not a good way of governing a country. Further to this, Stalin got rid of some of the best and most experienced army commanders and weapons designers. This hugely weakened Russia at the start of World War II, and it took some time for Russia's army leadership to get back up to strength. Describe what happened in the Purge, first of all. Secondly, explain one way that the Purge strengthened Stalin's power. Thirdly, explain how the Purge weakened Soviet Russia. And fourthly, study source C, which I find a particularly interesting source. What can we infer about Stalin's attitude towards his enemies? Well, let's have a look at source C. A before and after photo showing how a victim of the Purge, Nikolai Yezhov, was edited out of a photograph with Stalin. This is like an early version of photoshopping. It's fairly crudely done, but by the standards of the time, it's pretty clear what's been done here. Okay, pause the video here and answer those questions. Let's move on to the final case study. Case study number 4, the FiveYear Plans. Stalin recognised that the USSR had fewer modern factories and industries than other countries. In some respects, Russia was over 100 years behind other countries in terms of its progress. Stalin started a series of 5-year plans between 1928 and 1941. There were also some after World War II as well. The first 5-year plan collectivised the farms, causing the famine and terrible action against the Kulaks that we looked at in case study number 1. However, new factories were built. This provided modern work and machinery for the Russian people. Mechanised tractors and road transport were developed, as were railways. This made a lot of the work done in the USSR far more efficient and modern. Stalin also wanted to prepare the USSR for war. He knew that lots of other countries really hated what was going on in Russia and that he had many enemies around the world. Stalin wanted the Russians to be ready to resist attack. This included, incredibly, a plan to evacuate whole factories if the USSR was invaded. This is something that actually did take place. In 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded the USSR, it was just strong enough to defend itself. They had to give up thousands of miles of territory to the German army, but they were just strong enough to stop the German army and then eventually over the course of the rest of World War II to roll them back and win. However, this was at a cost of millions of lives. You're probably seeing a trend now. We keep on returning to this idea of millions of people dying. After all, Stalin himself once brutally said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic." Cold stuff. So all of these economic advancements were achieved at a cost of millions of deaths from overwork, starvation, and executions. So your final follow-up tasks. I've not included the writing frame on this one here because hopefully you got the hang of it now. What were the successes of the 5-year plans? You can bullet point these. In your view, were these successes worth the terrible cost? And thirdly, study source D. What can we infer about the changes brought in by the 5-year plans from this poster? This is a 1932 poster, and the caption reads, "By the end of the 5-year plan, the collectivization of farms should be virtually complete." Stalin is shown looking over everything, and a tractor, which would have been modern for the time, is shown out the front. Alright, pause the video here and complete that final case study. Time to finish off. Have a look at this poster. Source E is a French cartoon by a Russian artist from the 1930s. So this is a Russian artist who was living in France at the time. It is a sort of dark joke, an idea of a travel poster pretending to advertise travel to Russia at this time. Stalin is shown next to huge piles of skulls, and the caption reads, "Visit the USSR's pyramids." A bit of a play on the idea of going to visit the pyramids in Egypt. Firstly, describe 3 facts that show that Stalin's Russia would have been a hard and frightening place to live. Secondly, explain one way that Stalin made Russia more modern. Thirdly, study this cartoon on the right. What was the artist trying to say about Stalin's Russia? And lastly, the cartoon was drawn in France by a Russian artist who had run away from Russia. Why would this cartoon not have been created in Russia? Pause the video while you complete those tasks. Just to return to that last point, I hope that we recognise that the grip that Stalin had on his power and the lack of freedom of speech in communist Russia meant that to produce a poster like this would have meant certain death, or at the very least being sent to a gulag for the rest of your days. This would have made such opposition to Stalin's rule completely impossible in the USSR, as it would have been in other dictatorships like Nazi Germany. And at that point, this lesson is at an end. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and if you did, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much for watching.